In this episode, we talk about Code School and how it works behind the scenes with Code School's CTO, Thomas Meeks, and we also celebrate Scale Your Code's first year. Hey, fellow developers, my name is Christoph Limpelaer, and this is the Scale Your Code show. Now, this is a really cool interview for me because it not only marks the first year anniversary for Scale Your Code, which by the way, started in February of 2015, the 16th of February to be exact, with Thomas Griffin, a WordPress developer. So that was my very first interview, which is just really exciting. I never thought it would go this far, or it would give me this much opportunity to meet so many people, not only the interviewees, but also just Scale Your Code listeners who have reached out to me, which I thoroughly enjoy. So thank you guys so much for making this an amazing first year. And to celebrate this first year, I've got the Code School CTO Thomas Meeks with me today. Now, Code School, if you're not familiar with it, Code School offers interactive programming courses and coding challenges. So this opens up a lot of really interesting questions. Like, for example, how do you check students' code? Because students can go in there and interactively type the code, and then it tells you, hey, this code is right, or hey, this code is wrong. You got to fix it before we can keep moving forward. So how do you run that code? How do you make it secure? Does it run in containers? How do you scale those up and down? Those are all really interesting questions to me that I can't wait to ask Thomas. Now, first, let me thank DigitalOcean for making this episode possible. DigitalOcean offers simple cloud hosting and is built for developers. They're offering a discount for listeners. If you go to scaleyourcode.com/DigitalOcean and enter promo code ScaleYourCode, you'll get a free month on a 1 gigabyte droplet. And I'll tell you more about that in just a little bit. But first, let me welcome Thomas.
Hey, thanks for welcoming me. I'm really excited to be on the podcast too. It's kind of a neat thing for me. It's the first interview I've done in a long time. So
is it? Well, awesome. Yeah. And I was just telling you before we got started that Code School is something that I started with a few years back. And I don't know, you guys have been here since 2011 or so, I believe. And I
Mhm.
can't remember when I signed up, but I was trying to learn more about front end development and engineering and that sort of thing because I had more back end experience. And so Code School just kind of allowed me to give it a shot at a very affordable price. So I highly recommend you guys check it out if you haven't already. But Thomas, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got started with Code School in the first place?
Yeah, so I've been a developer for about 14 years. I started off in the Java world and was very happy to move over to Rails quite a while back. So I've done everything from Java desktop apps to web applications, and a lot of server ops in between. So the story of Code School starts around 2011. It was born out of a web consultancy called Envy Labs that I was working for at the time. And kind of the point of that consultancy at the time was to try and create multiple products. And then Code School ended up being super successful, and that was the only product that they ever made. So a lot of us jumped over from the consultancy, myself included, to Code School in 2014, if I remember right.
That's funny how that starts out. Didn't even really plan for it, and the first thing you tried after consultancy worked out perfect. So that's
Yeah.
fantastic. And I really can't blame you with the Java development. I actually just graduated college recently, and that's what we focused on primarily, just learning Java and working with that. And after just a few years of that, I was kind of ready to move on to something different. So I can't blame you on that front. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do as CTO of Code School and what that job is like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I'm actually a director over a few different departments over at Code School right now. So I spent a lot of my time being a hub for communication, mentoring other people, kind of making strategic decisions about Code School, especially on the technical level of things, kind of making sure that things move forward. On those technical tasks, everything. But I also make it a really big point to do some coding and server administration type of stuff every week. I think it's really important to me to stay in touch, so to speak, with the work, the day-to-day stuff. It just kind of feels weird at this point to let it go entirely and just be in management. Um, so yeah, it's kind of been an interesting transition for me. It was really scary to transition from kind of like the senior dev role into a CTO sort of thing. Um, but it's been a lot less coding, and things are a lot less clear cut than a passing spec. People are much harder, but they're also a lot more exciting. I found that kind of working with people, mentoring, all that kind of stuff, and taking a higher level view of things has been immensely rewarding.
It seems like it would be really difficult to switch back and forth between those different roles like that. Do you have any tips for anyone that might be in a similar situation that's maybe been a developer their whole life and they're starting to transition towards a CTO role?
Yeah, so one of the kind of advantages a little bit of code school is that we have these work at home days, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I don't actually work at home, but we do avoid scheduling meetings on those days. So they're kind of like these really solid days where you can sit down and get work done. And that would be probably the biggest thing is having a solid day, at least one, hopefully two a week, where you have almost no meetings and can get through some technical tasks. I think it's important too to even if you can't or if you don't have a week where you can do that, to be involved with your team, do code reviews, things like that with them, so that you have a clear idea of what's going on.
Mhm.
Um, I think probably the biggest piece of advice though would be, don't underestimate how difficult it will be to make that transition from programming to working with people. Once you start kind of getting into that realm, it's very interesting. It's something you have to take seriously, and as long as you do, things will usually work out all right.
Now, I've interviewed a few CTOs on the show in the past, and some of them have told me that they got to a point where they couldn't really do any hands on work anymore because they
Mhm.
felt like it would harm the company more than anything. And do you think that's something that happens when you get to a certain size or a certain point with the company, or is that something you can kind of work around?
I think it's something that naturally happens when you get to a certain size. If you wanted to make time for it, no matter how big the company is, you could probably do a little bit every month, although you probably wouldn't be able to do it every week. But yeah, there does come a point where you have to make sure that you're delegating enough, right? That's another kind of thing that's hard to give up when you know how to do something and you think I could just do it, but you can't because you don't have time and you become a bottleneck. So it is kind of important to be able to be willing to give that up
Mhm.
and slowly spin yourself down as the company grows and as you add more developers.
Right, so I'm not sure how much of this information you can actually give out, but can you give us a rough estimate of how much traffic you serve or what kind of scale you're running at with Code School?
Sure, we're doing about 10 million page views with probably about 10 times that in terms of internal API calls. Um, let's see, we're running about 40 small servers to keep Code School running, although that scales up and down on a somewhat regular basis. It depends on exactly what we're doing. And we can get crushed pretty hard. We've been able to scale ourselves out to about 10 times traffic
Mhm.
without making any major architecture changes. So
What platform are you running on?
servers,
Mhm.
we're running on Linode actually.
Linode, okay.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the architecture behind that? So you said 40 servers. What are those servers and what do they do?
Yeah, we're so Code School is kind of organized in a service-oriented architecture. I wouldn't go so far as to say microservices. Each of the individual services are pretty big, but we're separated into separate clusters for each of the services. There's five right now. Each of them have their own database server, and each database server has their own spare sort of thing. We run at least three application servers for each of the clusters, a worker server or two, depending on how many are required. Um, so it kind of allows us to scale up our databases independently of each other. We're able to spread that load around. If the front end website, the .com, is getting hammered really hard, it doesn't necessarily affect courses,
I see.
things like that.
So you've been able to clearly separate what each server does as far as like its role. So like you just said, if you've got an issue with the main server, that doesn't take down the courses and vice versa.
Correct. Yeah. So in all of these different services are usually communicating through REST. We are just a real big REST shop, although the communication between things is generally pretty simple. So we've been kind of lucky on that area. Although we're also starting to dabble in RabbitMQ as well.
I see. So you use primarily Ruby on Rails. Is there any other language you use or
Yeah, vast majority is Ruby on Rails. We actually do a lot of JavaScript now, especially for courses to kind of get that interactivity going on. It's All of our newer courses are actually in a pretty big Angular app.
I see.
Um, Besides that, there's a tiny bit of Python, and yeah, that's really about it.
Was there any really big insight into why you chose Ruby on Rails?
Yeah, Ruby on Rails is kind of this amazing framework. It does so much for you that it's kind of weird to step into another framework like Node after being in Rails for a long time. One of the main reasons we jumped into it, because honestly, is because as a consultancy, that's what we were most familiar with. And I think, honestly, there's a lot of value with sticking with what you know when you're firing up a new product that is full of unknowns. But at the same time, we've also found that it scales really well and that it handles the load really well and allows us to develop applications very rapidly. So, while we're also seeing a lot of technology companies moving to Node, and we have as well in a couple small places, we tend to only do that sort of thing when it's a very, very small service.
It's one of those dilemmas where maybe you want to start a new project or you just want to practice and you have to decide, well, do I want to use something I'm already familiar with and that's going to allow me to probably develop things faster and not make as many mistakes? Or do I try to move forward with some newer technology that I've never used before? I know that's a pretty interesting dilemma and it probably depends on who you're asking, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at something from an engineering or learning perspective, trying something new is always fun. But from experience, starting a business or a product is really, really hard. And you need to simplify as much as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're really serious about starting a business, I would strongly encourage you to stick with something you know,
Mm-hmm.
unless if there's a strong technical reason not to.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around how these, I'm going to call them sandboxes. I don't know if you have a different term for them, but those
Mhm.
coding sandboxes where students can go in and type the code and then that you guys check the code with whatever backend engine you have. How is that laid out? How does that work behind the scenes?
Right. So yeah, it is really interesting. We have about 7 or 8 servers dedicated to that right now. They're split into two different clusters. One's called our legacy executors, and legacy executors are a hodgepodge. They are whatever it took to get it working at the time. If you go back to some of our older Ruby courses, they are actually running in JRuby using some of the sandboxing features inside of there to keep things separate, along with whitelisting and blacklisting. We had some pretty fun little security exploits where people found different ways to call out into Java from when they figured out that it was running inside of JRuby. We also have some Rails executors that are running on MRI. That same sort of thing are you're getting your code thrown into some random name module, and then we're whitelisting it to make sure that you don't do anything weird. Um, and then I think maybe the more interesting one is the R executor that we did for just the R course is a one-off thing, which just shells out to R and is secured through AppArmor. Um, and the iOS executor, which was a complete one-off for us, where we ended up buying or leasing 25 Mac Minis in a data center, installing VMware on each of them, running 6 copies of OS X on top of OS X, and setting up this crazy, actually interesting enough Java-based messaging system so that they could all talk back to a central server, receive messages with people's code executed inside of all of the normal iOS tools and apps. So we're still running that one for Try Objective C. It's been kind of interesting to see how all of those different ones come together.
Now, when you mentioned JRuby, if somebody's never heard of that or never used it, how would you describe it?
JRuby is basically so like when you think of Java, the Java runs on top of something called the JVM. It's the Java Virtual Machine, which is a very, very good system for running an interpreted language or any language, really. An enormous amount of work has been put into it to make it fast and secure. So a while back, when CRuby or MRI, as it's called, which is compiled CRuby, um, wasn't so great, kind of slow. A lot of work was put into porting Ruby over onto the Java virtual machine. Uh, and it has its advantages and disadvantages. It's kind of slow to start up compared to normal Ruby, but it's also faster if you let it run for long enough, sort of thing.
Hmm.
So,
Okay, and so this is, are you able to, and this is the older model, and then you've gone over and created a newer model? Is that what you're
yes,
saying?
yeah, we created a newer one. We've called it Tutor, which is all Docker based. which is
Okay.
probably comes as no surprise to anybody who's at all familiar with Docker, which allows us to spin up tiny little servers. Each one is used for one request and then thrown away, which is a lot more flexible and allows us to spend a lot less time developing executors. That's really the primary advantage of it. It's actually a little slower per request than the old way because of having to spin up Dockers and all that kind of deal. And we've found plenty of performance scotches with Docker that we've had to work through, primarily around file systems. But yeah, it's a really nice scalable system.
Hmm.
So what we do there is we have a little Node app that manages it. It's very tiny, and build a Docker image that runs all the code and runs all the tests to check the code inside of it. And we usually spin a number of those up and let them sit on the server unused and just use them as requests come in. And then spin those servers back up, those containers back up out of band, outside of the request.
And so that's all automated. It does it as the requests scale up or down.
Yep, it does.
This reminds me a lot of the interview I had with CodePen, where they have a very similar model. They have the Docker containers, and they switched to that, I think, maybe a few years ago, if I remember correctly. When
Mhm.
did you guys switch to something like, or to Docker?
We switched to Docker not that long ago. We started using it heavily about 7 months ago.
Okay.
Primarily, the reason was that we were doing a lot of JavaScript courses, and that's kind of our third way of doing execution. Is if it's JavaScript, we just run it in your browser.
There you go.
Yeah, which makes scaling that very, very easy. We used to run some JavaScript on our servers, but uh, Phantom.js turned out to be a really big pain point with some of those things. So yeah, all that's just run in the browser now. So for about a year, that was where most of the work was going. So we didn't have to do much maintenance on our executors.
With JRuby, you said that you could whitelist or blacklist certain things. What about with Docker? How do you maintain or how do you control security there?
We don't really. We just kind of let Docker do its thing. There are a few things that we kind of keep an eye on, but generally Docker itself is fairly secure. We don't allow code to run as root inside of the Docker container where possible, for example. Um, but once the code's run, we trash that container and spin it up from a copy of the image. So we just have resource limits to make sure that someone doesn't try to take up a bunch of memory or take up a bunch of hard disk space, things like that. But
Now, are you running those containers inside of a virtual machine?
yes.
Yeah, okay. So that's one approach that some people take, to have more security in some cases,
Hmm.
where you that way you have a harder layer, so to speak.
Hmm. Yeah, and all of those servers too are considered completely untrusted by the rest of
Yeah,
our
right.
infrastructure, of course. So, if honestly, even if one of them does get hacked, it's just not that big of a deal. We just trash it and spin it back up.
And so you just check the result of whatever student's code is. So you run the code and then you have something that checks the result. And if
Hmm.
it matches the result you expected, then the student can go on. If not, then give it an error. How are you able to give hints though? Because I've taken a few courses, and sometimes when you write the code, it says, "Hey, I noticed you did this, but you may want to try doing it this way instead." How do
Right.
you tell that? Is it again checking the result and comparing to a list of things you have?
It is. So the very vast majority of the time, we're just using the normal testing frameworks that you would use in that language. So in our Ruby courses, we're using RSpec, and JavaScript courses, we're usually using Mocha. So we just write a bunch of tests and kind of parse the test output to see which tests fail. And depending on which tests fail, that determines what kind of hint we give.
I see.
Um, there have been a few cases where creating a parse tree and going through that has felt like the better solution for looking at people's code, especially on courses that are a little bit more beginner, where there's about 100 different ways to do the same thing. So sometimes we go that route, but it's pretty rare.
And what's a parse tree?
It's kind of a way for basically when you're going through a language or when a computer is looking at a language, it needs to take each of those English words and tokenize them out into something that the computer can actually understand. And then it creates a tree that lists out how the code would be executed. So once you create that, basically parse the code and get it into a point where the machine can understand it, then you can walk through it and see what somebody's actually trying to do. So, for example, if we say something like, please write a loop, it's not necessarily accurate to use a regular expression to look for all the different loop commands because you don't know if the loop started correctly, if it ended correctly, things like that. If you use a parse tree, then you're actually breaking it down to a place where the interpreter can read it, and then you can walk through the parse tree and see, is this an actual loop that's correctly formed and does what it's supposed to do?
I mentioned a discount from DigitalOcean at the beginning of this episode, and I'd like to share why I thought this sponsorship could really benefit you. DigitalOcean is not only one of the easiest cloud platforms to get started with, but it's affordable and it's built for scale. Don't just take my word for it. Look at the platforms using DigitalOcean. You've got Docker, Red Hat, Akamai, Zendesk, and a ton of others. In fact, it's the fastest growing cloud infrastructure provider. DigitalOcean lets you customize your own infrastructure or choose from pre-configured one-click images like Node.js, Docker, and a bunch of others to quickly get you started on your project. Go to scaleyourcode.com/digitalocean and type in promo code ScaleYourCode, which is all one word, and you will get 1 month free on a 1 gigabyte droplet. An entire month. Do you know how much you can learn or even build with that much time? Go to scaleyourcode.com/digitalocean and type in promo code ScaleYourCode. And then come tell me what you built. I'd love to see it. Now that you've used Docker to run this code and to maintain the core section of things, do
Mm-hmm.
you think it makes sense, or have you already done this, moving Docker also to your main or core services, like for databases and things like that?
I'm personally not convinced quite yet. I think that Docker makes a lot of sense if you're just starting out and you'd like to save on cost and make it a little bit easier to scale up. Um, it is definitely a lot easier to, take that pain early on and then be able to move the Docker containers to other servers later on. Right now, though, I think probably one of the things that has me not so convinced on is that we use a really nice application called Passenger to manage Fusion Passenger to manage all of our services, all of our Rails and Node services, and it feels, although it's not really anything like Docker, in practice it feels a lot like Docker. It keeps them separate. It spins them up and down for us. It scales them up and down for us, and it just hasn't been anything where we would gain a lot um, from a business standpoint to switch over to Docker.
I see. And what are some of the other tools that you use, for example, for a database or caching or anything like that?
hmm So we use PostgreSQL everywhere as our database. It's definitely our database of choice, and we really love it. It's been really nice on the scaling front. For example, our database servers are just 16 gigabyte linodes, and we have an enormous amount of headroom just on scaling that vertically right now. Um, and we've not really hit any major problems with scaling the database because we've been kind of careful from day one, kind of cognizant of that as to how exactly we're using them. When we start doing really heavy number crunching, we pull all that from the read spares. For caching, we use both Memcached and Redis. Redis is probably our bigger cache. We use that on the courses both to cache the courses themselves. Courses are kind of an interesting thing at Code School. We write them in a DSL and they end up getting compiled and loaded into the app. So Redis caches that for us. And we also use actually Memcache to cache code submission. So when you submit code, if you submit the exact same code as someone else, we don't bother executing it. We just return it Memcached, which saves us a lot of time on some
Yeah.
of these courses.
Is there anything else you're able to share like that?
Let's see. I don't think, on the codeschool.com side, we're not doing anything too particularly interesting in terms of caching. It's just kind of your normal page caching and partial caching that's inside of Rails
Hmm.
to let us toss pages out a little bit faster.
Yeah.
We've experimented with some Cloudflare CDN caching type of stuff, but we kind of keep finding that the JavaScript gotchas on that sort of thing just slow development down too much.
Hmm. Yeah, it's probably pretty complicated to try and share that load for the caching. So if a student already wrote the same code, you don't have to re-execute it again. I'm trying to think if there's any other use cases where you could share that load like that. But that sounds pretty complicated. You have to be sure it's exactly the same code and all that stuff.
Yeah, in some cases we kind of keep it pretty dumb, and because we've noticed that a lot of students just copy paste hints. So that makes it a lot easier on us. You can't necessarily just do things like strip out white space and that kind of deal. So there's a lot of different ways to make sure you're not getting a cached request. Like if you toss in a comment with a bunch of gibberish in it, obviously we're not parsing out comments or anything like that. So
Right, because you can have different spaces.
mhm.
One extra space could make it look completely different. That's a very
Yeah,
interesting challenge there.
yeah.
Now, you said you use both Redis and Memcached. Why? Why not just stick to one or the other?
By and large, we use memcache where all we want is just this a really simple, dumb cache that we can communicate. It's going to store some plain text sort of thing and dump it back out for us. We use Redis where we want to use more of the Redis features like arrays and hashes and things like that
Mm-hmm.
inside of Redis itself. Our course application especially makes pretty heavy use of a lot of the extra features in Redis.
Mm-hmm. All of the really rich data types that give you different things like that. Because I know you've got, or you had a forum at one point. I don't know if you still have that or not. And
We
then
do.
you also have a section with podcasting and all that. I know you had at one point you could vote on a course that you wanted to have.
Mhm.
So, hey, ask the community, do you want a course on this or do you want a course on that? And then you'd have all the different voting for that. I wonder if that was using Redis. I don't know if you know that or not, but because that could be an interesting use case for Redis, definitely.
Yeah, that would be. I don't remember if that was using Redis or not, though.
Sure,
It's
sure.
been a while since I've been around.
So you said that Postgres is really your go-to. Is there a specific reason why?
Yeah, there's a lot of specific. There's a lot of reasons why I'm a big fan. So I've been using Postgres for the full 14 years, and it's one of the things that makes me really love it is that it doesn't tend to die when you put it under a complex load, right?
That's a good
Um,
thing.
Yeah, I've killed Redis by just putting it under a heavy write load, and I've killed Memcache in the same way, and I've seen MySQL die in a similar way. So Postgres will slow down, but it doesn't just stop. And I know a very long time ago, PostgreSQL had a reputation for being very slow, but it seems like they've taken that very seriously and have pretty much reversed course on it. I've been blown away many times at the speed of it, just in things like, um, for example, the JSON data type that's in there. We've started using that a little bit here and there, where we're storing JSON messages that come in from services like Pluralsight or from Stripe and never really planned on querying them. But in PostgreSQL, you just cast it to a JSON. It looks over the million rows and finds it in less than a second, which is kind of impressive when I didn't create an index or do anything else that normally you do to make these kind of things fast.
What kind of data do you have to store in those databases? Do you have to store user progress and user accounts? Is there anything else that, yeah, I think you just mentioned like Stripe detail and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. So codeschool.com kind of is the business side of things. So it stores all of the user data. It stores the information that we need from Stripe. Obviously, we're letting Stripe handle all of the PCI compliant type of stuff, credit card numbers and everything.
Right.
Um, we do store kind of a summary of user progress on courses on Code School so that we can display that, which badges they have, which achievements they've earned, what videos they've viewed. Inside of each course, we actually also store every submission that everyone has ever done, which is kind of a rich piece of data that we haven't really explored yet, but is kind of nice. And how many times people have taken a course and how far they've gotten through it, sort of thing.
Is that how you're able to tell that somebody just copied and pasted the hint by storing that information and querying on it?
Yeah. Yeah, we've gone through. That was one of those things that we got real curious about a year into Code School and started poking around in some of the submissions and finding out how similar they were. And we were it didn't immediately hit us until somebody checked it against the hint and found out that it matched the hint. So
See, I would have never thought that you would store that kind of data, but now it makes perfect sense because in some cases you could even tell, like, hey, students are really struggling with this section. Let's see if we can figure out why they're struggling so much in this section. And you can really look at every single line of code they wrote. And if you see similarities between that, that'd be really interesting. I wonder if you can do some kind of data mining with that. That's really really cool.
Yeah,
Now,
uh, we have a little data mining tool called Guidance that pulls down progress on individual courses and individual challenges and shows us where people are dropping off. And once we find that, we start digging in a little bit deeper.
and that's something that you build custom.
Yeah, it's a small custom app that pulls data down through jobs from all the different databases that we have. And kind of
What's it built with?
that is actually built with Ruby on Rails
Oh, cool. Okay.
and D3.
So along the same lines of D3, yeah, to visualize the graphs, and D3 is really really powerful. I
Yeah,
started getting into it just a little bit. I don't really have a whole lot of use for it now, but if anybody's interested in data visualization, it's such a powerful library.
yeah, it's amazing.
So along the same lines of monitoring, what other kinds of monitoring do you do? Are you able to tell when your database slows down so you can send somebody to check it out? What kind of tools do you use, and what do you monitor that way?
Yeah, so we've switched around a few different times. Right now, we're using a service called Datadog to monitor all of the servers. I'm a pretty big fan of it. It makes kind of keeping up to date on all that stuff pretty easy. And my favorite metric to just watch on all of the servers is a line graph of load. Load is kind of one of those often underappreciated and underutilized metrics for how a server is doing because it tells you they can just be a watch for I/O, memory, and CPU all in one number. So that's kind of the primary way that we check to make sure that no one server is getting crushed too hard. Besides that, we also keep an eye on the kind of the top level metrics. We want to make sure that response time is not going too high. So that's one we watch very closely. We watch proxy errors on our internal load balancers to make sure that the application is responding when it should, and we can kind of tell the difference between, hey, the internet is having issues today, or code school is having issues today, sort of thing. Since that's becoming more and more common, it seems. Um,
Why is that?
I'm not sure. It might be as we get more and more customers. It seems like especially if we sign up, like for example, a business out in India or Europe or something like that, and we'll start getting reports of issues and end up kind of tracing it back to their ISP, or that particular part of the world is under some kind of massive DDoS attack that has a particular line between us and them congested, and this is not a whole lot we can do about it. So as that happened more and more, and it's not like it's something that happens on a weekly basis, but you can dump a lot of time into that. We started finding it pretty useful to start kind of monitoring internal network performance, just so that we know if it's us or them, sort of thing, at a quick glance.
Are
Um,
you using any tools to do that, to monitor that kind of detail?
Mostly, we're monitoring it just through Datadog by keeping
Oh,
a
I
really
see. Okay.
close eye on the on HA proxy.
Okay. And what about the performance metrics? Seeing how long it takes to load a page, is that also something you can do through Datadog or
We use both Datadog and New Relic for that.
New
Uh,
Relic? Okay.
yeah, so we keep an eye on how fast the load balancer is getting responses from the servers through Datadog, and then New Relic is kind of keeping an eye on how fast we're rendering, how the internal performance of the application is going, and what the users are seeing on the end.
Is that what they call the APM?
Yeah, they're
Application response.
app deck stuff.
And I know they have a few different ones. Some for the browsers, some for. Okay, cool. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, New Relic's a really nice tool. It's a little pricey, but it's really useful. So
Yeah, right. And that can make a big difference when you have issues. Like you said, you can dump a lot of time in some of these issues sometimes, and that can be pretty painful for sure.
it can be, yeah.
All right, so I'm looking at my notes here. I don't think I have any more architecture questions. Can you think of anything else that we could talk about?
Let's see. Um,
Because I definitely want to talk about engineering culture as well, and just development process and all that stuff. But I want to make sure we don't miss any interesting details. I think that's a pretty good coverage of that general information that way.
yeah, I think it is.
All right, cool. So let's talk about culture then. What's it like working as a developer or engineer at Code School?
Yeah, so it's actually a little bit different. I feel like than at least what I read on Hacker News and other places around the internet about. how this works. So, as I mentioned before, we've got a couple of work at home days, Tuesdays and Thursdays. We are pretty big on in person collaboration, though. So, we do try and get everyone here 3 days a week so that we can have those quick face to face meetings and things like that. Once you get down to like, if you're a developer, we do try and keep those meetings to a minimum. So, usually your work week is primarily set up on Mondays. We don't do daily stand ups or anything like that. It just kind of, every time we've tried that in the past, it's always devolved into I'm working on this kind of thing that goes around and just doesn't feel all that useful.
Mhm.
Um, let's see. So I think probably the really interesting thing about us is that we're really big on do what works for you. So we don't try and lay down like a personal development process for everyone to follow. You can do test driven development if you want to, but it's definitely not required. Or you can do behavior driven development or document driven development or whatever driven development, soda driven development, anything that works for you. And we just kind of care about output in general. Another I think we have a pretty big emphasis too on keeping the teams pretty small and tight knit and working together on a pretty constant basis. We want to try and cultivate friendships so that people really enjoy coming to work and want to do their best for their friends rather than doing their best for the company necessarily.
So do you group people for certain features that they're working on, or does it kind of is there a clear separation between different teams like that, or is it just more you have these teams that can collaborate together?
By and large, we've gone towards a clear separation of teams that work on individual code bases. We're finding that this wasn't true so much a couple years ago, but now things are getting big enough and complex enough that there's a lot of value to working in the same thing all day, every day, so to speak, so that you can get familiarity with it and start to learn that 70,000 line application and kind of have a feel for it, as opposed to jumping around from application to application,
I see.
um, which kind of just ends up being way too much spin up time for everybody.
How big of a team do you guys have?
We have 16 developers right now.
16 developers. Very nice. So you don't have any concrete principles that you have to follow? Is there one thing that engineers or developers do have to follow in order to be able to work there, or is it
There's a few concrete things and one thing that's a little bit more amorphous. I think we're really big on finding your own work, so to speak. It's not. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's quite like I know, for example, a company like Valve Software. It takes that to the logical extreme, where literally people just will not tell you what to work on. But it's while that's not quite true here. If there's gaps in your work, we kind of encourage people to go find things that they're interested on and things that they feel like they could improve the company on, and go work on that. As far as concrete things, we do ask people to work inside of pull requests and make sure to get their pull request reviewed, make sure that tests pass. We do run continuous integration and kind of have a general feel for each project as to where the code coverage should be, which is usually around 80%. And make sure to test things on staging before they go to production. So there's a few concrete things, but exactly how you get there is not something that we really lay down the law on.
and what tools do you use for continuous integration?
Travis CI is our main thing that we use for it. And we have that integrated through GitHub and manage all of our PRs and issues and everything like that through GitHub as well.
Awesome. Well, Thomas, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me today and helping celebrate the 1 year anniversary for Scale Your Code. If people want to reach out to your code school, how do you recommend they do so?
Well, anyone's actually welcome to reach out to me at thomas@codeschool.com if they feel like it. We've also got a great support team here, and our forums are a good way to reach out to us. Keep a pretty close eye on that. But yeah, other than that, we've also got the Code School Twitter account. It's a pretty active thing. So
Do you have a Twitter account?
I do. It's not particularly active, but it's Thomas Meeks.
That's right. Let's see. I read a tweet from there. I think last year. Oh man, where was it? It was interesting. Back in June of last year, saying that you switched to Fusion Passenger 5, which we talked about. You said it was noticeably faster.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you noticed by just browsing around the website after you had switched to Passenger Fusion, or was it using those tools, being able to see the metrics drop down?
It was more on the metric side of things. I think there wasn't too many pages where we could notice the difference just by seat of the pants because it was more of like a 100 millisecond difference. Just kind of tough to notice. But it was kind of interesting to flip that switch and then suddenly see all the graphs drop and stay at a new level. So,
Well, and the 100 milliseconds isn't that noticeable to the human eye, I guess, but if you add those up, multiply it by 10, yeah, that's a
mhm.
pretty big difference right there. So it's
Yeah,
always nice to shave off some time that way.
yeah, it is.
All right, well, thank you so much, Thomas. I really appreciate it. Everybody, please leave a comment below and help share this interview to thank Thomas. Also, if you could do me a really huge favor to help me celebrate this 1 year anniversary, go to iTunes and help rate Scale Your Code. That really helps me reach new people and a bigger audience. So thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And on to another year. Take care.
Thanks, you too.